welcome to another exciting episode of 4020 Not Live, in which we try and dissect whatever's been going on in the world of Rugby League in the past week or so since we last spoke. Phil is here, as ever. Paul Bennett is back again, my fellow... well, we're not on furlough, we're just kind of saying, why didn't the government cancel the redo the furlough before everyone got, P45s and stuff?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what's happening there. Something might happen. I don't know. No.
And in gainful employment, and joining us for the first time from the Yorkshire Evening Post is Peter Smith. Pete, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. Phil, should we start with Toronto?
Well, we were going to do this on Monday, weren't we? But the truth is, if you think 4 days is a long time in American politics, try 125 years of non-expansion in Rugby League. I was trying to think of a word that sort of sums up the mood of the sport at the moment, and the best I could do was dispiriting. I think everything we've seen this week is just a sad reflection of where the sport is. There's been absolute heroics in keeping it going during this time, and we've said it every time we've done a broadcast that the players have just been a shining light to do what they've done for less money to keep the sport going has been magnificent. But whether we've had that same level of administration in the last week, I'm not sure. I think if you're going to start with Toronto, there are probably two things to divorce from each other. One is Carlo Livolsi's bid, which we've seen a bit of, but clearly we don't have full details of, and I'm not sure anybody does. And the statement that basically said, let's not bother with North America because it isn't worth it. And I think you got to treat those separately, because the first one is a decision that is made on the information that's available. The second one is one of the crassest things I've ever heard, and that's without using a swear word.
What have you made of the events of the past 7 days or so, Pete?
Well, it's just sad, isn't it? For everybody involved, really. The sport, the players at Toronto, the fans at Toronto, the whole organisation. So I think Phil's right, dispiriting. So sad for everybody involved. We had so many expectations of Toronto, and a year ago everybody was getting excited about Sonny Bill and the prospect of them coming into Super League, and now all that's gone. The statement, I agree with Phil. I mean, to say that it's just not worth with North America, a huge market like that, it's just bizarre, and it shows what Rugby League's all about, really. It's so parochial, so small-minded. There's a complete lack of foresight by anybody who's making the decisions, really. I feel a little bit for the RFL, because people keep saying to me, it's the RFL are a disgrace. They're not fit for purpose. But the RFL actually voted in favour of Toronto. It's Super League who were against them. So the RFL are getting blamed for something that's not their fault. I think hats off to the clubs who voted in favour of Toronto, Leeds, St Helens and Catalan. They've all taken a forward-thinking approach, but some of the others are just stuck in the 1980s, as far as I'm concerned.
Paul, the 1980s, we're stuck.
Good times. I'm quite happy to go back to the 1980s now, I think.
Just thought you were talking about my fashion then.
Sorry, 1950s, I'll make it then. Yeah, I wouldn't mind being back in the 1980s, actually. 1950s.
I hear the vote might have been fraudulent, because at one point Toronto were winning 4-0, and then all of a sudden all these votes miraculously came against them. It was very strange. It's very disappointing, familiarly depressing. Rugby League, I think, disappoints in a way that no other thing in my life certainly can, because it's the hope that kills you, the old cliche. It's the hope for better things, that we might be onto something, that we might be able to grow, and then it's the inevitable removal of that hope. And that's what we've experienced again. I agree completely with what Phil said. It's one thing to judge that Carlo Livolsi is not fit to take over this bid, and that Toronto would not be sustainable under his leadership. I can I'll be willing to accept that verdict. I mean, obviously, I haven't seen any of the evidence for or against, but if that's the determination, I can buy that. The statement that there's nothing for rugby league, no value for rugby league in Canada, in North America, I think is founded on what? I think you could make that report say absolutely anything you wanted it to, and it's clear what they wanted that report to say. I think there were an average of 7,000 people for home games. Definitely disagree with that assertion. That is a figure that is higher than many clubs, a few clubs within Super League, and certainly everybody else outside it. There's some potential there. The question is whether you have the will, the desire to invest in it, and clearly those at the top don't. And that disappoints the likes of us, I think.
I think there's something else as well. And you're right to bring up the average of 7,000 fans. I think the one thing that we can say is if you look at any one of the clubs that voted, and I'd here like to raise a banner saying anybody who didn't vote because they abstained, that is the biggest abdication of responsibility at a time like this that I've ever come across, and they should be ashamed of themselves. But the other thing is that there is no club currently who is going to get 7,500 new spectators. So you can look at everyone who voted in that, be it whoever, Hull KR, Castleford, Leeds, and Ellens, whoever, they are not going to get 7,500 new spectators. So to throw away a potential new market at a time like this is almost a dereliction of duty. That's the first thing. I think the other thing is we also need to start calling this for what it is. And that's starting to happen a little bit in America. And I know there isn't an obvious parallel here. But the fact is, this is a victim of petty politicking. That from what I can gather, Robert Elston made this about me or the others. He was very anti-Toronto for whatever reason, but went into that meeting to take his position by saying, you either back me or get rid of me. And the majority of people who supported the view of excluding Toronto are the people that brought him in the first place. I don't think we even need to name the clubs. We know who they are. We know who the people were who were behind the so-called coup. And if you look at the split in voting, that's exactly the way it's gone. And there are some people there who I think at one stage were prepared to support Toronto or give them a little bit more leeway, who changed their mind when it came to a vote because they didn't want to be seen to back down on what might be deemed to be a waste of money. And I think that's reprehensible, and that needs to be mentioned more when the analysis boils down to why we've got to the situation that we're in. That's the saddest aspect for me, that people haven't voted on the basis of even how it might affect their club, because I think we've seen with a club like York that if you have a proactive view on what Toronto can bring when you play them, they're actually a benefit, rather than trotting out this ridiculous line that they don't bring any away supporters with them. But we didn't get to even discussing that. We're going to vote along party lines, and that again, I think that argument is 125 years old, and we've fallen into the same trap again.
And as I've said a million times, Phil, and said it last week to Avery, we can't expect suddenly North American TV to come up with loads of money for a sport they've never heard of before the last 4 years or whatever it is that Toronto exists.
I think that's the other thing that we probably need to discuss, and there's minds on here that are far bigger and cleverer than mine, is, what are the implications of this decision? Because it's clearly not just that Toronto won't be in it next year. It's how do you approach Sky at a time when we are renegotiating a deal and sell them the idea that this is a progressive forward-thinking competition that they should invest in. We'll then no doubt get into the debate about how you replace them. We've got this vague statement about criteria are going to be decided, and an independent panel are going to make that decision. But you look at all of the people that are putting themselves forward at the moment, and there is a flaw in their bid. And that flaw gets exacerbated by the fact that they're only going to get half the amount of money. So as far as I'm concerned, the timing of excluding Toronto when you are trying to get more money out of a broadcaster and not less just makes the whole thing even more unfathomable. I may well go and cry now.
Where do you see the future then, Pete? For these are big questions for Rugby League going forward. Let's start with 2021. How do we fill that gap in Super League? Who would you? That's a hard question to answer. But what kind of club would you want to see replacing Toronto?
Well, that's the big thing, as Phil says. We don't know what the criteria are yet. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how they're going to come up with criteria that the present 11 clubs all meet, for one thing, because whatever they base it on, you would think that some of the existing clubs are not going to meet those criteria. Whether they're going to come up with, decide who they want to bring in, and then find criteria that club already meets, I don't know. But financially, it's a tough time, isn't it? Everybody's struggling. There's a pandemic on. There's still going to be a pandemic on at the start of next season. We're still not going to have crowds back at the start of next season, as far as we all know, unless something miraculous changes. Some clubs, let's face it, don't have the facilities to meet Super League standards. If they were playing now based on standards, they wouldn't get in. Performance-wise, I don't know how you can take performance into account when nobody's played for, it's 7 months now. Do you look at expansion of the sport? Well, we've just turned our backs on that. I mean, you'd say, well, let's look at Toulouse. They'd be good to have another French team in, or let's bring London back. We need a presence in London, but we've said we're not interested in expanding the sport. So I just don't know what the criteria are going to be and how they're going to make this decision. It's just going to lead to more wrangling, more infighting, more arguments, more people saying, "Oh, I've had it with Rugby League." I'm surprised that they went with 12. I honestly thought that they'd stick with 11 for next season, and then at least they could have, if they wanted to go up to 12, they could have made it performance related for 2022. But they've decided not to do that. But then, as Phil mentioned, the club that come up aren't going to get the same amount of money as everybody else. So they're not going to be able to compete. It's simple mathematics, isn't it? If you spend half as much on players, your squad's going to be half as good. So I honestly can't see the logic of any of it.
It's all about who produces the best video, Paul, obviously. It's just all going to be won on social media.
Pyongyang for Super League, absolutely. I think it's an easy decision for me. I think it's Toulouse. I think that's the only option here that allows Super League to excuse itself from the image of it shrinking, of it contracting because it's got rid of Toronto, of it looking like a backward sport or a sport that's moving backwards. I think the only way that they project a different image to that is to get Toulouse in, to say that actually we are in favour of expansion. It's just that we didn't think Canada was right. Toulouse is completely different. They are a club that's been going for 80 years. They have a fan base. They have a Rugby League as a traditional heartland in the south of France. It is different to Toronto. I personally would have preferred them to come in as well, but that's not going to happen now. So for me, I think in terms of the image that you portray, the optics of a sport that's growing, that's expanding, Toulouse is the obvious one for me. They've been a competitive team at the top of the championship in recent seasons. They have facilities. They have a support base. They have a big population around them in the way that some of these small town teams in the UK don't. There's room for growth there. I think Robert Elston actually is a fan of Toulouse as well. I think he has a positive opinion of it from what I've spoken to him about that or heard from him about that in the past. That's been limited, but my impression is that he thinks that that's an area of growth, as opposed to London, which also gives the same message, but unfortunately, we've been there many times before. There seems to be a limit to what we can do there, regardless of how much money David Hughes throws at it, and God bless him for trying. But I think there's a limit to what London can be. For Toulouse, I think the potential upside for us is massive and strategic. We talk about strategic expansion. We've got a club in the south of France. It makes sense to have another one. Catalans have been successful on the field. They've got a support base. They can only be strengthened by a second French team. For me, it's obvious.
I think we've strayed into two areas here, though, that haven't yet been fully explained. One is this is effectively a return to licensing. So whatever we're talking about with it being criteria, it's not on the field based. And obviously that's something that the sport wanted to move away from, that they felt that it wasn't something that they could police and administer. So if we are going back to licensing, you can't just do it for one club for 1 year. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is it has to go hand in hand with what your opinion is on promotion relegation. Because again, there's absolutely no point bringing a club in, giving them half the amount of money, but there being an exit route immediately. Because, you know, we all loved watching London last year. But before a ball was kicked, we all said, London are spending half the amount of anybody else. London are favourites for relegation. What's the point of bringing in a team that can't be competitive? And what happened? You know, for all the fact that we absolutely loved watching London, they got relegated and all of their best players were picked off by all the other clubs. And if we're going to make a serious grown-up decision here, which clearly on the basis of what we've seen this week we're not, those are the things you've got to address and look at. That it isn't just we'll get an independent group together, which will be questions as to whether it's independent. We'll make a decision for 1 year, which is hardly strategic in any aspect whatsoever. And then we'll be exactly back where we were in a year's time. You know, that's how we set out in 1895, and we still haven't got beyond the M62 corridor to all intents and purposes.
I think there is a point, and it's that the Super League for 2021 sort of needs a useful idiot. That's how I see it right now. I mean, if it was looking for useless idiots, it might have more luck. I mean, there might be a few on here. We could help them out. But it needs a 12th team in 2021, but it would be handy for those 11 clubs that are already in Super League if that 12th team came up and then, you know, after a year weren't there anymore and the rest of them survived. You know, maybe I'm being a bit cynical there, but it would appear to me that this 12th team is being set up to fail. I don't know how you justify giving them half of the central funding. If anyone can explain that to me and justify why that's the case, especially when they're coming in at late notice, don't have the preparation time, don't have the time to recruit, and you are giving them half the money that everyone else gets. I don't get that. To the point that for teams in the Championship, I'd almost be tempted to say, you know, actually, no, I don't want to be in this year. I'll take my chances next year on us getting promoted, and then when we do come up, I'll have the full amount of money. You've got to be confident. I think if you want to take that spot, you've got to be confident that you're going to survive. Otherwise, I don't really see the point. Toulouse might feel, actually, if we get in, even without the full amount of money, we might have the resources to actually still spend to the salary cap for 1 year, that we keep ourselves up in the league, and then it's worth it. We get it back then the following year. But yeah, again, I might be being cynical, but it seems to me they need a team to be the 12th team, and you know, if they happen to get relegated the following year, then you know, so be it. Someone else will be along the following year, won't they, to maybe do the same.
We've got to fill a spot of the Magic Weekend, haven't we? Can't have 11 teams
yeah.
there. Even though we might have a Magic Weekend in front of any fans, we don't know what's going to happen next year or what's happening this year, even with the format changing so soon. I'll throw you an easier one this time, Pete. Toronto, do you think we'll ever see them play another game?
That's an easy one.
You'd like to think so, wouldn't you? But the noise is coming out of Canada at the moment, and I've not seen any specific evidence either way. But the noise is coming out of Canada certainly suggests it's not going to happen, which should be a huge shame. I mean, we've also got Ottawa now, haven't we? Who were due to come into League One next year, 2021, and this week have deferred for for a year. So I suppose that they're talking about coming in 2022 now, but there's going to be a question mark over what happens there. I mean, they must be wondering, well, what's the point? You know, we can we get to Super League. They don't want us. They don't want a Canadian club in Super League. They don't think we add anything to the competition. So if you're about to pour a lot of money into that particular pot, you might think twice about it. I would hope that Toronto could survive in some shape or form for the fans as much as anybody else. And, you know, perhaps I've not actually been to a game at Toronto, so I'm only going on what people have said and what I've seen on television. But I think from what I understand, they've created an event culture there where people go for the event rather than specifically to watch Toronto play Castleford or Coventry Bears or whatever. So maybe if they continue and they can still put on a show off the field as well as on it, perhaps the fans will stick with them if they continue. But I think it's unlikely. I mean, where is the money to keep them going to come from? And it's been made clear that the ultimate ambition of Super League's not open to them at this stage. So I suspect we won't see them again now.
The only way we might is if there's a change in governance. Because I think this again has highlighted two things. One is it constitutionally correct for those who are in a league to vote on the future strategy of that league? And was the RFL culpable in the agreement that they did to allow the setting up of this Super League? Because we were all told at the beginning that the governance of the game was still going to be with the RFL. And the RFL have voted for Toronto to be in Super League and Ottawa to be in League One. We were told that Super League and its board would be essentially a marketing organisation responsible for the top flight and the top flight competition alone, which would include negotiation of its television deal. Clearly, something is amiss with the way the sport is constructed at the moment when the RFL don't get a say on strategy. So they've come up with a report that says we need a team in Toronto, we're prepared to admit a team in Ottawa, and 3 years down the line, a group of people have got a vested interest in that decision, have said, actually, we're not sure about that. Well, you can't run a sport like that. You can't run a business like that. So if the governance of the sport changed and the Super League clubs reverted to an agreement whereby they market competition and the governance of the sport was put back in the hands of whatever the RFL now is, then yes, Toronto might be back. Where they would play initially, I think that's another question, but we're on the verge of wasting a huge opportunity here.
Well, they're going to play in York, weren't they, next year, according to these plans, which Sean sent us a load of questions. He said, how anyone other than the clubs, RFL and Super League and the executive committee has seen the presentation proposal, or has anyone rather? If not, it's impossible for journalists to present an unbiased view as they're only going on what's being fed to them. And all the reporting after the vote was coming from the against camp. Dear me, Paul.
So those agendas out in force.
These agendas are everywhere.
It's not John Davidson again.
He's banned. He's banned from this podcast.
No, listen, we've had. I had a bit of a discussion with this on our latest podcast with John. I think there are many of us who are emotionally invested in it. I think a lot of us are, and we want it to succeed, because we felt that the game needed something drastic in order to survive. It's not about, for me, expansionism versus the M62 corridor. It's not that we see that the future is away from the Heartlands. It's that the Heartlands need something. They need an injection from somewhere, and we needed to bring something in from outside, in my view, that could bring benefits that could then strengthen the Heartlands. It's not abandoning your base. It's about doing something new that can help to strengthen them long term. So I think a lot of journalists were invested in Toronto succeeding. Others, obviously, they have sources for these Super League meetings, people that they speak to, even though there's supposedly not supposed to be any leaks out of them. Those things happen. they're only going to be able to act on what they're told. You have to be aware of that. You know, you're getting information from your sources, sure, but can you trust it? The only way we could ever really trust it is if we get some transparency from Super League, that they publish the bid documents, that they publish the report into whether there is a future in Super League for Super League in Canada. If they show us that what went into the workings in those decisions, then that gives us the transparency that we might be able to properly be able to talk about this. But I don't expect it, and they will probably feel that they don't need to, because they're not accountable to us. They're only accountable to themselves. The Super League board, that is their accountability to the clubs. So I don't expect that we'll get any firm actual factual info on any of this, certainly not in a comprehensive manner. So yeah, we're left to act on the information that we got, Rich, and we'll all have our own things that we bring to the story, but hopefully we're all objective enough to see both sides.
Speculation is what we deal with best. Some of the as you mentioned earlier, Phil, it is a bit like politics at the minute. Everything is so parochial, and people have taken sides and they're not going to change their views on those sides. But from a perspective of, the stuff that's sticking in the throat at the moment is all the people going, not just of the players, but of the staff and of suppliers to Toronto Wolfpack. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Toronto Wolfpack were always going to be a financial mess or a failure, because there are plenty of clubs in Rugby League in the past 10 years, 5 years recently, who have gone through financial difficulties and changed ownership and so on and so forth. So it seems like people are quick to stick the knife into Toronto for whatever reason.
I think we're missing the point by concentrating too much on Toronto. I think this is more about something that Paul was just starting to talk about there, about what the sport's future is, and I think it's becoming increasingly stark. And we've spoken about this on the podcast. We've written about it in our magazine, that if you want to be a bigger fish these days, you have to have a global element. That's just the way the world works, whether we like it or not. That's not something we have any control over. There's absolutely no doubt that we've probably all been up for the last 3 or 4 nights watching CNN News, and you wouldn't have been able to do that, a few years ago. The world is a much smaller, shrunken place. I suspect we all watch State of Origin, live. You couldn't do that. We had to wait for the tapes to come into the local video shop not that long ago. And that's not just me that's old on this. We all had to do that. So I think if you're serious about what you want to be, you have to have a global presence. I think that the other side of that argument is that if historically you have come from an area that is being deindustrialized. Now, why that is happening and who's doing it and how it's happened is a debate for politics. It's not really for a sport. But the fact is that this word heartlands refers to an area of the country that has probably had more of its resource stripped than any other in the last 25, 30 years. And all of those resources were the underlying bedrock of what Rugby League is and was. It provided the players, the fans, the sponsors, so everything to do with the sport over the last 25 to 30 years. Well, let's not forget, it's been at its richest in terms of the amount of money that's been brought into it by a broadcaster. Hasn't stopped the foundations underneath crumbling, and if you're trees in your garden the roots are starting to wither and die, you go and plant another forest somewhere. Now you try and save some of those trees if you can, but you look for the field next door and maybe plant in there as well. And that's my worry, that if we don't realise that that's the nature of the world that we're in, then Rugby League will still survive, but it will become Speedway. We'll go back to being part-time. Our best players will be picked off. Our top clubs may be ripe for moving into a different sport alongside clubs of a similar size. We'll still be there, but we just will not be at the top table. And Pete knows as well, if not better than anybody, how hard it is to get a story in a newspaper at the moment, particularly a national paper, never mind a regional one. And that's only going to get harder if we don't have the access to the likes of Toronto.
It's short-termism, though, isn't it? Because clearly the clubs, when they made this decision, weren't thinking about what happens in 5 years' time, or probably even 2 years' time. They're thinking about next, or even surviving till next season, and that's the problem. There isn't a long-term strategy in rugby league, and there never has been. There's lots of people who have ideas on how they'd like the sport to develop, but when it comes down to it, it's survival from week to week, or month to month, or season to season. We all heard people saying at the start of the pandemic that it would be a win if we got to the end of it with every club intact, and that's the sort of thinking that unfortunately is surrounding the sport at the moment. No one's interested in the health of the game in 10 years' time. It's what it's going to be like next season.
To almost invoke the name of a great leader of the past, Pete, do we almost need a Maurice Lindsay style figure to be at the top of the game and just run things as a benevolent dictator in a sense?
Well, you know what I mean. Yeah, honestly, I think the sport could probably do with that sort of figurehead. Yes, and for all Maurice's faults, and we all know what they were, he did a lot of good for the game as well, and the game certainly had a higher profile when Maurice was involved. I'm not suggesting we get Maurice back involved, but it could probably do with somebody who will make some tough decisions. I mean, we're going to get the name Hearn's going to get mentioned again, isn't it? If we continue in this direction. We all saw the quote that Eddie Hearn gave to I think was it the Financial Times recently, which I can't repeat on here unfortunately. But he doesn't think rugby league's got much of a future. But the problem is the clubs were never going to turn all the control over to the Hearns, and at the moment the Super League clubs have the power, and I just can't see why they would want to give that up, although it's clearly in the game's better interests. And the fact that the RFL had exactly the same voting power as Salford or Warrington or Wakefield says a lot, doesn't it, really? The clubs are running the game at the moment, and they're not going to back down from that.
No, especially when they're in survival mode now, as you say, Pete. They're looking to survive as businesses first and foremost. And, you know, if that comes at the cost of a few clubs outside the Super League, I think quite a few of them will take that. And I think that's actually what will happen, because we look at the next Sky deal and there's a mooted reduction in the amount of money from about £10 million per year. I think we were given some information, weren't we, at the time, which some people contested from within Super League, but they didn't really give us any clarity on why it was wrong. That had the figure drops by about that amount, 10 million, that basically the clubs outside Super League will be getting nothing. And that, in fact, the Super League clubs will be able to maintain a certain level of funding by the fact that they're not sacrificing some of the TV money for the rest of the game. I can see that happening. And when that happens, if that happens, then clubs will inevitably fold, I think. And I think this is, you know, we talk about opposition to Toronto and expansion from within the heartlands, but if you take note of some of the attitudes of some of the clubs lower down the food chain in the heartlands, very much in the heartlands, they're very much in favour of Toronto, because they could see that. They could see that something needed to come in that could be transformative for the game, to maintain the levels of funding that would keep them alive, or at least keep them functioning in any way as professionals. I think the game is basically going to start seeing clubs drop off from out of COVID, but over the long term, you know, very much like COVID in society. I think the effects are going to be long term rather than we got everyone through the original lockdown and we've all survived, yeah, for now. But what about the long term health effects?
Well, Phil has come back at the right time, some would say, conspiratorially for these clubs, Phil, especially below Super League, and those Super League clubs whose seasons have finished prematurely this week. It's a perfect opportunity to put people back on furlough.
What a conspiracy theory!
That was one. That was one said to me by someone who also said that. Not Eddie Hearn. He doesn't want to lose, and he's not interested. That Robert Elson only is interested in Toulouse and not Toronto. But I don't want to tell you who came up with that.
Is that the conspiracy theory that he's got a summer house down there?
I've not heard that one.
Hashtag positive rugby league. I think Pete's absolutely right by saying it's short-termism of the worst kind, this sort of decision. But what I would say is we've been operating short-termism for 125 years. So when does it become it's the policy and strategy of the sport rather than it's just the latest manifestation of it? And I think that if anything does come out of this, it's that there need to be people who passionately care about the sport and its future, that are prepared to look to 3 and 5 years and to find a level of investment that's outside of what we currently have. Because I am convinced that there are people out there who want to invest in professional sport, provided it's attractive enough to them, which goes back to there being a global element of some sort. And if you can persuade them to inject capital that isn't there at the moment, then the way you take the power out of the hands of the clubs is just to give them more money but less voting rights. And I think we're at a point now where all of that is actually up for grabs. And the clubs, for all the seeming position of power in making this decision, are actually weaker than they've been probably since 1994. How did we get Super League through in the first place? There barely wasn't a solvent club. You know, by then Leeds were on the verge of going bankrupt because they'd been trying to chase a full-time Wigan. Wigan were on the verge of going bankrupt. They had to sell Central Park because the model that they'd come up with wasn't sustainable. Widnes, who were the other powerhouse at the time, they were on the verge of going bankrupt because they'd spent money that they hadn't got and couldn't find a way of recouping it. Hull and Hullcar had their golden period in the 1980s, but were now suffering the backlash of overspending, and clearly in the 90s weren't the force that they had been. We're almost getting to that point now. That the way to move this forward with a degree of positivity and also strategy is to say somebody needs to bring in some kind of external investment. External investment will not stand for the game looking exactly as it does at the moment for the foreseeable future, and that has to change. And I think that's one of the things that goes against Toulouse, that actually all of the issues that have been brought to the table with Toronto apply to Toulouse, unless they come with a television deal, unless they bring away fans, blah, blah, blah. Same argument. There's no point getting rid of Toronto. So you have to decide on what your strategy and your policy is. And then there's an idea that you can move forward looking beyond what might happen next week.
So I'm not going to ask us who we think should replace them definitely in Super League, because there's no point, because A will only upset people. And B, we don't have a choice in the matter anyway. Although I should say that there's at least one club I've seen who are putting a bid together. And I'm thinking, just don't waste your time. Just concentrate on where you are and what you're doing, and build yourself up as a club. And then perhaps you can be in Super League when you are ready to be in Super League.
Is it Scarborough?
Well, it could be, couldn't it? It could be. Well, maybe we should bring them back as well. I mean, you can buy their shirts again. Elgin have bought their shirts back. Paul, you mentioned the TV deal. I read in the Sun yesterday, because someone put it on the internet, that BT might be interesting, which is, I'm going to have to roll back on my anti-BT stuff, because I'm going to try and get a job there. But at least if there is some kind of bidding war, potentially, then that can't be a bad thing, can it?
No, I haven't read that. I don't read the Sun. Sorry, Gaz Carter. I do sometimes read your stuff, but you know.
That's why I said I read it on Twitter.
He's a good guy, Gary. I haven't read that, so I can't profess to know much about or anything about this BT interest apart from the fact you've just told me about it. I will believe that when I see it. I'm not convinced. Like, I don't know what evidence is presented in this, but I think it's Sky or nothing, personally. Why are BT suddenly coming to Rugby League now? What do we have that they see and they think, yeah, we'll have a slice of that right now, especially when they'll be cutting back as well, won't they? Surely, maybe it's a cheap pickup for them. Maybe that would be something. It's some content that fills some hours and it's not expensive compared with other sports. Maybe. I don't know. I'm not getting my hopes up about that. But yeah, bidding war would be nice from what you say, Richard. Maybe Channel 4 be back in and other pipe dreams. Who knows?
Free sport, yeah. Have you heard anything, Pete? Or are we just putting all our eggs in the Sky basket again?
Well, I'd heard that BT was sniffing around. I mean, Phil was there when this conversation happened, actually, when somebody at a game said that, oh, have you heard BT are interested? This was, I think, last week or the week before, but like Paul says, it's one of those, you'll believe it if and when it happens. I would think that it'll be Sky or nothing. I mean, it's a nice thought, isn't it? It would be good to have maybe a fresh approach and certainly to have some competition. That would help the sport in terms of the deal it's going to get, but I can't see it happening. As Paul says, why would BT suddenly become interested in Super League now if they've not been for the previous 25 years?
Well, it would certainly suit Super League, wouldn't it, if the rumours of BT Sport potentially being interested were to circulate at this particular point. So,
well, it's when players are coming out of contract, you always get, Leeds are interested in them, but they're not.
I think there is a case for saying that sport now is consumed in more bite-sized packages, so it may well be that all of a competition going to one broadcaster is not the way things are moving ahead. I think that there is a feeling within the sport, and again, who knows if this is true or not, and we may as well start the rumour here, that there are going to be two packages for Super League. That one is going to be the predominant Sky pick their 2 games a week that they want, which might be, clearly what they deem to be in any given week the 2 biggest games, and that another broadcaster will be offered a package that would be maybe 10 live games across the season, which would be second choice matches and a magazine programme. And if that is the case, then I think Channel 4 are interested in that. I think they see that to do a Rugby League Raw type revisit from a headquarters in the middle of all of that, with ultimate access to all of the people to create different narratives, is actually the kind of content that they produce. But I think what they'd want to do is like what they did with the NFL when it first started, is they'd need highlights of everything else to give it context. But if Sky were prepared to pay less but give up a little bit more, you could see that being a potential package. And then you're looking at the Championship, League One, Test matches, the Challenge Cup being bundled up as a third package, which could be of interest to the BBC, who currently have the bulk of that package, but they may be able to, instead of having the Super League show, and which might go to Channel 4, to have a Championship roundup show. So I think if they're really clever, there's maybe a different way of selling the package, so that whatever you get in total keeps everybody solvent. But I'm not sure how far I've just made that up in my own head, or there's any truth in it whatsoever.
Are you just remembering the programme that I pitched on here a couple months ago? Is that what it is? It's just seeped through. I still think that's a good idea, by the way. I'd love to see Rugby League on Channel 4. I'd love us to be the new Kabaddi, or, Football Italia, something like that. A bit of a cult following. That'd be great. I definitely think we need to diversify, and I think splitting the package up into different packages would be a wise move. So I hope that is something that they're looking at for sure.
The Channel 4 logo holding a rugby league ball as opposed to the American football with the helmet from the 80s. Obviously we've mentioned Toronto, and they're not going to exist next year, we don't think. All their players have found new clubs already. here we go, Paul, then. Where's their coach going to go? Because there's at least 2 jobs in Super League that are perhaps open. I mean, I joked on this programme last year that probably Lee Radford would be worried about Sean Wayne, but now Sean Wayne's gone and Lee Radford's gone. Here's Brian McDermott, ready to take over at Hull, Huddersfield or wherever.
Yeah, well, like you, Richard, I'm sat on my backside at home doing no work, so I'm completely out of the loop. I can't give you any insight, but what I would say is that he'll be absolutely a good pickup for somebody, wouldn't he? He has a proven record of winning Super League. He's Super League's most successful coach. That's right, isn't it? So, when you've got an opportunity to appoint somebody like that, I think you've got to seriously look at it. I think he could inject a bit of steel, perhaps, into some teams that perhaps have lacked it recently, and a couple of those are without a coach right now. So, yeah, I could see that definitely happening. I've heard other names being linked to the posts at Hull and Huddersfield as well, but he'd certainly be worth a shot for somebody, wouldn't he? I mean, not maybe not as fun to deal with in the media, if anyone has any comments on that, but from a rugby league perspective, from a results perspective, he'd be you have to say that he'd be a strong appointment.
I'm led to believe, which means clearly I don't know at all, that Hull or Huddersfield would be difficult because they're not amenable in their ownership to being told exactly how their club is going to be run. We're in the realms of a certain Brian Clough here, that there were certain clubs prepared to cede to Mr. Clough virtually everything. And be prepared to be told exactly how they had to be run. Neither of Huddersfield or Hull fit that bill, which is why it probably won't work with Brian McDermott. I think the other thing, and I do believe this to be true, is that about 6 weeks ago he was offered an assistant coach's job at Cronulla. And he took the decision to say, if I walk away from Toronto now, then I wouldn't expect their bid ever to be picked up by anybody, because whilst every player should find gainful employment, if the guy who's trying to hold it all together walks away, then the bid, in essence, has less credibility attached to it. So I am reliably informed that he turned that opportunity down, and he may have lost that opportunity, and for him personally, I think that will be a shame.
Where do you think he'll end up, Pete?
Well, I've not heard the Cronulla rumour. I just wouldn't see Brian McDermott going somewhere as an assistant coach, having seen the way he operates for over, 8 years at Leeds, 8 seasons at Leeds. He wants to be the man in charge, and I'm just not sure that it would work, him taking orders from somebody else. I'd be very surprised if he went to a gig as an assistant coach. As Paul says, there's going to be no shortage of clubs interested in Brian Mack if and when he becomes available, because of his record at Leeds. It was exceptional. Not so much in terms of league consistency, you'd have to say, but in terms of winning big games, then I don't think there are many coaches can match his record. He can certainly come up with a game plan and the motivation to get a team up when it gets to a semi-final or a final. He will get offers. I don't know what he's thinking. I know that when he was at London, he was working on zero resources, and I know he found that tough, as he'd freely admit he has done in the past. And I don't think he'd want to go to back to that sort of scenario where he's having to scrape a team together week to week. But I think if he got a shot at one of the bigger clubs where he'd have something to work with, I think he'd relish an opportunity. But he's, as Phil mentioned, he's not the sort of guy that's going to walk away from Toronto, I don't think, until it's absolutely dead and buried. But once that happens, I'm sure he will be on the market, and I'm sure he'll find a club to go to sooner rather than later. Obviously, you don't want to speculate about clubs that have a coach at the moment. I mean, people can if they want, but I wouldn't like to do that. He's been at Huddersfield. I'm not sure he'd particularly want to go back. Maybe he would. He had 2 spells at Leeds. Hull would be an intriguing one, I think. A big club like that. I hear what Phil says about wanting to do things, have control over the whole club, but I'm not sure that was the case at Leeds with Gary Hetherington in charge. That's 2 fairly strong-minded characters. He's shown he can work with somebody like that. I mean, they had a very good partnership until Gary sacked him. But yeah, I think the prospect of Brian Mack taking over at Hull would be an intriguing one.
And wouldn't you love to see Adam Pearson try to sack him live on TV? Like, good luck with that, mate.
Yep. You do know you're really dealing with an ex-Marine. I'd run.
And professional boxer, front rower. Yeah, doesn't suffer fools gladly.
Before someone pointed out, Paul, of course, he wasn't sacked on the telly, Lee Radford, so you have to... people get upset because you know what people are like.
Don't want that, do we?
One of the hidden great stories of this week, Phil, is Salford's points deduction, or deducted 3 games, if you will, for debts from a previous regime and this, that and the other. And perfect timing for that to happen when no one's paying attention.
Yeah, it just means that now they can't be on standby to get in the playoffs they haven't qualified for. So that is just so rugby league, isn't it? I think it might even have been Paul that tweeted, is this the most meaningless punishment there's ever been? And there's probably another rugby league one that's even more meaningless. But yeah, it ranks. It's up there.
I can think of one.
Why has it taken 7 years?
Jackson Hastings being suspended after he did.
Good call. Yeah.
Didn't that happen this year as well by the same? Oh no, let's not go there. But you know, why is it taking so long?
You would almost think there's an opportune moment now, wouldn't you? When
Is there
don't
anything
count for
else?
anything.
Yeah, anything else we want to brush under the carpet while it's up and the broom's out?
Yeah. Maybe you referenced them being on standby for the playoffs, Phil. Maybe that was the best that they could give of an illusion of them being punished somehow. Is that you could possibly have been in the playoffs. I mean, you wouldn't have been, but you could possibly have been. And we've removed that now, and you know that's your punishment.
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, there isn't a punishment here, and this is an opportune moment for them to, you know, forget those obligations and move on. And
I'd be going through that cupboard or drawer in Red Hall that's got all of the outstanding issues and just going, right, let's just clear it now. Was there anybody who was sent off in 1996 whose case we haven't heard yet? Oh, let's give him a 10-game retrospective ban.
I mean, Sean did ask when talking about that, is there a Dominic Cummings type character sat pulling the strings somewhere in rugby league thinking, right, what shall I tell them to do now that'll make themselves look proper stupid? That's a bit harsh, Sean. Deary me. Here's John in Bradford, brackets, long-time listener, first-time questioner. Like that, John. Should we reinstate the War of the Roses?
No.
John Bateman wants it back.
Yeah, bring it back and then scrap it after 3 years because the crowds aren't there. And then 2 years later, bring the Exiles back and then scrap that. And then start a campaign to bring the
other nationalities
back again.
Whatever happened to the other nationalities?
Just no, forget about it. It's gone. It's rugby league nostalgia again, isn't it? It's looking back to the days when things were better, and you know, wouldn't it be nice to have those days back? And yeah, it would, but it's not happening, is it? So no, sorry, John.
Here's a good question from Yam Yam. Another great name. How the hell have we ended up with loot fixtures again? Because we assume that if we're having 12 teams next year, then we're going to have loot fixtures, Phil, which I know you love.
Isn't that something that Marks and Spencers have just bought out for Christmas, a Yam Yam? I think it's more about how many home fixtures the club chairman have deemed that they need to be economically viable, and I think they're coming down to 13 plus Magic weekend. And that's why you have to have loop fixtures depending on the number of teams you have in the league. And we're not going on the basis of what's best for player welfare. We're not going on, do we need to put in an international weekend? We're not even going on, if we could find something that wasn't Yorkshire, Lancashire, how would we fit an Origin type series into our calendar? We're going with, let's start with home games. And we only want to play teams that bring away fans. And that's why we've got loop fixtures.
We did say at the start of this pandemic that we could have taken the opportunity to change things, but we've taken the opportunity to change very little, Pete, have we?
Yeah, it is a difficult time, isn't it? I don't know. Maybe we've been a bit hard on the clubs. They are in financial difficulties. They've not had income for what, since mid-March. It is a difficult time. I think, we have to recognise that. But yeah, it could be an opportunity to just have a fresh way of looking at things. But that's not going to happen. I mean, nobody wants loop fixtures other than the clubs, as Phil says, because they need a certain number of home games. It's going to be 13 home games next year. Magic weekend, 13 away games. Teams playing each other twice, and some teams playing each other 3 times. Nobody's interested in that. Fans don't like it, players don't like it, coaches don't like it. But it's a necessity as far as the clubs are concerned for their income, and it's probably even more of a necessity now in the situation we're in. It'll be interesting to see how they decide the loop fixtures next year, whether they'll specifically look at ones that will bring crowds in, whether they'll try and give clubs loop fixtures that are derbies, or whether it'll be drawn up randomly. I'm not sure, but yeah, I don't think there's going to be too much radical thinking on fixtures at the moment. Everybody just wants to get back to playing in front of fans. That's the bottom line.
Well, we're presuming, of course, that these 13 games are going to be played in front of fans, and I wouldn't necessarily guarantee that that's the case. Certainly not at full capacity.
Championship and League One have said they'll start if necessary before fans are allowed back.
Yeah,
haven't they? So I think it's widely accepted that probably certainly the games of the season are likely to be behind closed doors.
So in that case, do you need loop fixtures, and couldn't you just start a bit later? Give everyone a proper rest, have a proper pre-season.
Well, like there's a World Cup at the end of the year as well.
Almost as if there will be a World Cup at the end of the season, yeah.
Surely
bring the players back off furlough later as well.
I think
there'll be TV obligations as well, I imagine, as well, won't there? There's a certain amount of games to Sky, and Sky, I'm sure, will want content to begin as early as possible. So I'm sure that's part of the thinking as well.
I had to laugh last night when Sky, who was short of a live game, put on a Toronto match. Do you think that was done deliberately?
That's trolling, isn't it?
I think it is. I think that's Sky.
That's what I thought.
Saying, here's our 2 penn'orth. Other thing that you talk about innovation in fixtures, I would like to pay credit to ending the season early and starting the playoffs in a slightly extended manner. I think that has given meaning to what we've got left. It has protected clubs from hopefully the worst of the exposures to the COVID virus. It does mean that clearly the semi-finals are going to be great games. We know what they are. I couldn't pick a winner of either of those 2 semi-finals. That leads, effectively quarter-finals, aren't they? That leads into 2 semi-finals where, again, there will be home advantage. But at this stage in the season, I'm not sure there's a huge form line. And the grand final has me. I think the decisions they've made on just in the playoffs has been really good, and they deserve credit for that. I just think perhaps they waited a bit too long to realise it had to be done.
And even tonight's
the hand was forced on that, though, wasn't it? As I understand it, the recommendation was to continue to the end of the regular season, to the 20 matches mark, or as close as clubs could get to it, and then a top 4 playoff. But when Castleford couldn't complete their fixtures and Hull KR couldn't complete their fixtures, it was forced on them, really. But however they've got there, it's the right decision, I think, and it's going to certainly produce more meaningful matches over the final few weeks of the season.
even Wakefield Salford has something on it tonight, because it's a chance for Reece Lynn to show Sean Wayne he's made a mistake, not only putting him in the England virtual squad, which was announced this week. Another thing which was announced this week, and I completely forgot until I was thinking about Leeds Rhinos' new Melbourne Storm inspired away kit, is obviously the big controversy this week is Wigan have got a new badge, Wigan Warriors that is. And a new shirt, the famous Cherry and Blacks, as they're now called, Paul. What's that all about?
I knew you were going to ask me about this one. First of all, I would say, like, whatever you think of the new badge,
I've got to say, I don't care either way.
I'm not that bothered. I don't think it's as bad as some people make out. I suspect it's one of those that will actually be a bit of a grower in time. There was an alternative one doing the rounds that I thought was nicer, but they've gone with what they wanted. And fine. It's not that big of a deal. Clubs do change their badge periodically. That'll change again. They'll probably go back to some sort of more traditional badge later on when it served its purpose. They've done this already, in the past. For me, the strange thing was releasing a new, clearly cherry and white badge, and then 2 days later releasing a red and black kit. That was weird to me. Yeah, like. At least pick the same color of red, like to go with the new badge. That seemed a bit strange. Maybe the kit was designed independently. I don't know. But yeah, there's been a lot of fuss over my way about this. It's not for me, but I suspect maybe it's not aimed at me. It's okay. It's strange, isn't it, that Wigan would release a sort of modern, dare I say, American-looking sporting badge in the same week that Super League decided that North America is a waste of time. There's a bit of mixed messaging there, but
the letters page of the Wigan whatever newspaper, it must be full of them people complaining.
I haven't seen it, but I would. So yeah, well, Rugby League has an aging fan base in many respects, and they're gonna. A lot of people are against change, and certainly change for change's sake. Other people have won over by the argument of what we're going to try to do. I can see the argument of what they're trying to do. I think something nicer could have been created, but it's only a badge at the end of the day, isn't it?
Did Wigan pay a transfer fee to Widnes for the guy?
The Viking. Yeah,
he's a warrior, not a Viking.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think the logo of the Warrior particularly means anything to anyone in Wigan. I think they would have preferred something to be retained from the old badge, and you could perhaps modernise that. But yeah, it's a bit. When you look at the top sporting brands in the UK, I don't think any of them particularly go down that line that it has to be a sort of modern iconography. I mean, look at Manchester City, the biggest growing brand in the UK right now. It's got a ship on it and a red rose. It's sort of traditional elements of old badges incorporated into a fresh new design. I would have thought something like that would have ticked the box, but what do I know? I'm only a unemployed journalist.
The fans will decide if the colours work or not with the number of replica kits they buy. If they like them, they'll buy them. And the other year, Leeds bought out a pink away kit, which everybody went, you cannot have Rugby League players running around in such a pastel shade. And it turned out to be their biggest selling shirt for years. So the fans will decide on the colours.
Yeah, and it's obviously going to be a more important year than many recent years for shirt sales, isn't it? On a serious note, you want to shift a lot of them. So part of me would think, well, to do that after a year where you've had this throwback, but you've not had cherry and white hoops, you might go back to a cherry and white hoops. But maybe they think actually when we do go completely different, that's when the sales pick up because it's something a bit more unique. So maybe there's a logic behind it there. It's not for me. It's a bit Salford for me. It's not a Wigan kit. The kit is nice, but it's not a Wigan kit.
It's a bit Salford. I mean,
I don't mean that in a derogatory term.
No, but
I don't mean that Salford is new slang for something that isn't very good. I just mean it looks like Salford colours, just in case you get any letters
from
Gemma Carter.
Yeah.
From Gemma. Yeah.
I think on that facetious note, has anything else happened that I've completely missed? Because I know there's usually something I do miss.
State of origin.
Yes, well, as I mentioned it with bringing back the Yorkshire Lancashire thing. What a comeback by the Queenslanders.
If only Wayne Bennett could be a national coach.
Yeah, I saw a tweet or two, saying, basically suggesting that England might have been wrong to get rid of Wayne Bennett because he'd shown what he can do. But I thought it was notable that he didn't play a halfback on the wing in this one. He actually played wingers, and they sort of helped. The 3 quarters were quite important. I didn't think it was a great game at all, to be honest. I thought it was pretty disappointing. I thought the first half was pretty lifeless. That Queensland came back made it more interesting. The second half was better, but it didn't live up to the hype of Origin, of Origin's past. And my hope is that the conclusion is that the timing of the year is wrong and season, because if we did get to a state where Origin was at the end of the season on a regular basis, then that would be bad news for the international game, and particularly for England. So hopefully it's a damp squib, this series, just for the greater good.
I only brought it up in the hope that John Davidson would be watching this and I can go Queenslander. The only other thing I was going to mention, which is something that I think Pete is the best to talk about, is the return of Sean Long. Because I think it wasn't that much of a secret that he was looking to come back into rugby league and that there were huge cost cuts in rugby union. He wanted to be a bit nearer home, but not sure anybody saw that he would end up being the assistant at Leeds.
Well, he did actually, and Leeds didn't publicise it at the time. He did actually work with Leeds in pre-season, and apparently was very well received by the coaching staff and the players. He knows Richard Agar pretty well, obviously worked together at Hull. I think a lot of it boils down to the situation with James Webster, who they've been pleased with as assistant coach, but he obviously can't continue in that role next season when Featherstone start playing again. He's also head coach at Featherstone and assistant coach at Leeds, but players aren't going to be allowed to go on dual registration because they don't want them moving from one environment to another during a pandemic, and the same applies to the coach, so that they have a vacancy. And I think, as I say, having impressed them in the work in pre-season, they've gone in that direction, and it, from what the players I've spoken to about it are saying, he did a very good job and they're excited about working with him. I spoke to young halfback Callum McClelland about it the other day, and he says it was fantastic, not just for the halfbacks, but for the club as a whole. And he's certainly done well in an assistant coach role wherever else he's been. I had a look on a Harlequins message board when he left there, and people were disappointed he was going. So I think it's an interesting move by Leeds, and potentially a very good one.
Presumably James Webster couldn't be an assistant coach and a head coach in Super League.
Well, there is also that, yes. But yeah, he's obviously, I think the links will continue between Leeds and Featherstone, but not in a formal manner.
So if Leeds had a vote for who would be in Super League, then surely they'd be putting all their eggs in the Featherstone basket, he says facetiously.
Well, not necessarily. Not if they need a club to be their partners further down the food chain, because actually they'd be
that's true, yeah.
themselves there.
Yeah.
No, they need to keep them in their place.
I think Featherstone coming up would cause all manner of problems.
I think Leeds would actually
Leeds.
I think they'd back Toulouse, personally.
Gary, I think I have spoken to Gary Hetherington about Toulouse a while ago, because Leeds were due to play Catalans in Toulouse this season in May, which obviously didn't happen. But I think he spent some time there. I don't know if it was during the season last year or at the end of it, but he had spent some time with Toulouse and came back speaking very highly of the setup there and the relationship they've got now with the rugby union club and the facilities they've got and that sort of thing. I would suspect that Leeds would probably back Toulouse. Leeds are a club that tend to support clubs from outside the so-called heartlands. They've obviously helped with London in the past and Catalan, and I think I'd more or less guarantee that they'd like Toulouse to come up.
Well, one for you, Rich, maybe. Like, would Wakefield be pulling for Featherstone from a purely crowd perspective?
Yeah, because they could walk there, save some money.
I mean, now I'm now I'm a free agent and not working for any Super League club. That'd be interesting, wouldn't it? I mean, certainly when you look back at the Challenge Cup draw, that was one of the great things coming out of it. Was Wakefield and Featherstone, first time in a meaningful game since 1998, would have been a huge crowd. But COVID, I have no idea. I knew less about what was going on at Wakefield when I worked there than I do than I ever did on the outside. So we shall see what happens in the future. But I wish them well tonight against Salford, and fingers crossed, they'll all come out right in the end. Well, I think we're done then. I don't think there's any more rugby league to talk about. As we, I think have we talked ourselves into positivity by the end.
Doesn't sound like it, does
Hope
it?
not. Hope not. We've got the wrong panel if that's what you wanted.
You're watching the wrong show, aren't you?
Yeah.
No, I don't watch that one.
This looks like a remake of The Monkeys.
Oh dear. Well, Paul, have you got anything to promote? All your podcasts.
Toulouse Olympique for Super League. Yeah, but you can if you enjoy listening to me, I mean, there must be someone out there who does. Give us a listen at 6 to Go Rugby League podcast every week. Talking with the scourge of Toronto, John Davidson, reviewing the action. Some of the issues. We'll be looking at Origin. We'll be looking at the decision of Toronto going and who might replace them, and we'll be presumably looking at some the games tonight, because I suppose they have a point to them. The Wigan one does, I guess, with the league leaders shirt. So we'll be wrapping that up. Yeah, if you haven't had enough of me, then you can get plenty more there. And also, obviously, in 4020, which will be coming out, in a couple of weeks, Phil. My next column will be in that. I've written half of that already.
And the bonus section as well.
And a bonus bit from me, as well. It's just
if we're going to the league leaders shield tonight, can we expect St Helens to mount an objection saying that the votes were wrongly cast, or not?
Maybe. I mean, they were winning. They were winning, weren't they? And then
we
something
won.
happened. It's very strange.
Well, they should have gone to Catalans then. But I'm guessing all the best place to read all the great news in rugby league is in the Yorkshire Evening Post.
Yep, Yorkshire Evening Post.co.uk, please. All hits are very welcome. Thank you.
Gents, thank you very much for your time. Phil, thank you. I need to write something about TV because I've written about 100 words so far. Oh dear, I better get some work done. We'll be back at some point in the future, maybe at some point next week when we've worked out what we're talking about. So join us again for another exciting episode of 4020 Not Live.